Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait a couple of minutes while the room fills up. I see our numbers are slowly growing. Welcome, everybody. Okay, I think we can begin introductions. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Eleanor Beaver. I'm a researcher in the West Africa Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The report being launched today is the second in a collaborative series of projects between the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLID. If you'd like a copy of the report, you can scan the QR code on my screen to download it. This event is being recorded and live streamed, so please be aware of that. If you have questions that you would like to ask the panelists, please put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen at any time, and we'll address those at the end. This series looks at the relationship between armed groups and illicit economies in West Africa. The first installment of this series, which we launched a few months ago, focused on Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JNIM, in the Sahel. And this second installment explores the dynamics of armed banditry in northwest Nigeria. It aims to unravel their evolution, the structure of these groups, and the illicit economies that bandit groups engage in for financing and for resourcing, but also the way in which those illicit economies shape their interactions with residents of Nigeria's northwest. So focusing on this part of Nigeria, the report examines these internal dynamics of armed bandit groups, as well as the ecosystems and the landscapes in which they operate. And it identifies potential entry points for interventions. As you can imagine, this was a very, very challenging subject to gather data on. The authors who are present here today have put in a really extraordinary amount of work to make that happen, and we're really pleased with the final product. I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists before handing over directly to them. First today, we have Dr. Olajumoke Ayendele. She is the Senior Nigeria Advisor at ACLID, and she's a visiting assistant professor of practice at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. She has a PhD in global affairs from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, an MPA in international development policy, and a BA in economics, also from New York University. Next, we have Lawan Danjuma Adamu. He coordinated the fieldwork in the northwest, northeast, and southeast of Nigeria, and his position at the Global Initiative is the Northern Nigeria Field Coordinator for the West Africa Observatory. He is a co-founder of the investigative journalism platform Dateline Nigeria, and he is a former editor at the Daily Trust, which is a Nigerian newspaper. Finally, we have Dr. Kingsley Madueke. He is the Nigeria Research Coordinator with the West Africa Observatory of Illicit Economies Global Initiative. He's also a lecturer at the Center for Conflict Management and Peace Studies at the University of Jos in Nigeria, and he has a PhD in political science from the University of Amsterdam. Each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes and then pass directly to each other, and then we'd be delighted to take all of your questions at the end. Jumo, I will now pass to you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Nella, for the introduction. We're very excited to be launching this report as well as letting you all know our findings from this report. I am going to begin once we start sharing the screen because we have a presentation and some graphics that we would like to share with you all. All right, so I'm going to first begin by talking about the evolution of armed banditry in Nigeria. And I wanted to first start with the origins of banditry in Northwest Nigeria, which is the next slide that you see over on your end. And we wanted to first start off with this because a lot of times when it comes to scholars and policymakers and them evaluating what is going on in the Northwest, they usually start with 2011. But in our report, you would see that armed banditry in the Northwest has deep historical roots that really trace back to the pre-colonial era of Nigeria as a country. So in the 18th century, in the 19th century, we see that the region also faced armed banditry threats, especially when it came to transnational trade routes that linked the Northwest with markets in Ghana. So we see armed banditry engaging in, the theft of goods, small-scale cattle rustling. This sparked low-level violence, but this violence did not significantly threaten livelihoods as we know banditry violence does today, and which my colleagues are going to go into more detail in a couple of minutes. Now, in the 20th century, when it came to colonial rule in northern Nigeria, we see a little bit of the suppression of armed banditry. And this remained limited both during the colonial and post-independence period of the country, Nigeria. However, when we see Nigeria's transition to a democratic system of governance in 1999, we see that the region, the Northwest region, experienced a surge in communal conflicts and farmer-herder clashes that a lot of us on this call are probably familiar with. These conflicts were driven by intense competition over scarce resources, including land for cattle grazing and farming. Now, it is within this context that we see the reemergence of armed banditry as we know today, particularly among the Fulani pastoralist communities. And this resurgence involved, again, small-scale cattle theft and robbery. And I would also argue, and we argue in our report, that this contributed, and this was the start to the complex security challenges that faces the Northwest today in Nigeria. If we go to the next slide, which is the escalation and the diffusion of armed banditry, when we look at the dates 2011 to 2018, we see that armed banditry in the Northwest evolved. And this transformation was driven by several factors. The first being the banking sector reform, which reduced the needs for traders that were going on the road to travel with cash. And this made armed banditry or armed robbery less lucrative. We also see that this escalation from the farmer-herder clashes that we are a little bit familiar with and rising unemployment in the northern region, especially in the Northwest, that kind of made a lot of people mobilize and be recruited to a lot of these banditry groups. Now, in response to the rising banditry that we see, we have vigilante groups such as Yan Sakai emerging. And these were primarily composed of individuals from Hausa communities that wanted to stop a lot of these criminal activities. However, the young Kasai often employed heavy-handed tactics, as we know a lot of vigilante groups do in Nigeria, including extrajudicial killings of suspected bandits. And this, we argue in our report, further escalated the violence that we see today in the region. And this escalation triggered a vicious cycle of violence. Each instance of cattle rustling against the Hausa community, for instance, led the vigilante group to attack Fulani settlements, and this resulted in retaliatory reprisals and this increasing fatality that we start to see in the Northwest. Now, between 2012 and 2013, we also see both sides beginning to abduct prominent members of the community and vigilante leaders. And we argue in our report that this really marks the beginning of a kidnapping for ransom economy that we see in the Northwest today. Now, initially, some of these abductions were to force concessions or negotiate the release of captured members. But as bandits acquired sophisticated weapons, kidnapping became a real central revenue source alongside cattle rustling. And my colleagues are going to go into a little little bit more detail when it comes to the financing of armed banditry in a couple of minutes once I'm done with my session and my presentation. We also observe when we're thinking about the evolution of armed banditry that starting in 2013, we see insurgent groups such as the Jazz faction and Ansaru, who usually operated in the Northeast, beginning to establish bases in the Northwest, especially in Maru and Beniguari, where we actually conducted a lot of our field research and interviews. And we can also talk about the methodology if you have some questions, or I would encourage you to actually download the report so you can read the methodologies and why we picked certain local governments for our interviews. And by 2014, as a lot of us might know, armed banditry had spread from Zamfara to other northwestern states such as, Kaduna, Katsina, Sokoto, Kebbi, Niger, and Kogi. And for most of the banditry leaders, they exploited the limited presence of state security forces. Yet, as cattle stocks continue to deplete because of large-scale cattle rustling, we see a lot of herders also relocating their herds to safer areas further south of Nigeria. And we also see that between 2015 and 2016, bandits are starting to increasingly rely on kidnapping for ransom as a primary income source instead of cattle rustling. Now, with the graphs that you see, the first two graphs are using ACLED data. And it basically indicates that in both Kaduna and Zamfara, violent incidents involving banditry is peaking in 2011, or rather in 2021 and 2022. But we are also seeing that it has fallen in both regions, especially since 2023. While bandits remain the primary perpetrators of violence in both states, in Kaduna and Zamfara. So when we think about the political violence that go on in Kaduna, 85% of incidents recorded in Kaduna are attributed to armed banditry and 93% in Zamfara. We do show in our report that the distinct typologies of violence in both regions are remarkably different, and they show different trends, which I'm going to go into in a couple of minutes. So we see in both states, recorded violence targeting civilians have decreased since 2023. And especially in Kaduna, they have declined since 2021. And the second graph shows you that. And in our report, our research indicates two primary interlinked factors that are driving this decrease that we see when it comes to violence against civilians over this period. And we argue that the two factors are, one, greater territorial influence that the banditries are holding in some of the states, and two, the evolving revenue collection mechanisms that we observed when we went on the field and interviewed community members and leaders about the evolution of banditry. So first of all, we are seeing that bandits are consolidating their influence in many areas in Kaduna and Zamfara, which are basically their historical strongholds. And this likely contributed to this decrease that we see in violence that is directly targeting civilians, especially when we take this in the context of the violence that is tracked by ACLED and the ACLED database. The violence that we track includes attacks, armed robberies, and abductions, but we argue in our report that the violence targeting civilians is increasingly aligning with the broader literature on armed groups' behavior, which kind of tracks the inverse correlations between the level of territorial influence that an armed group would have versus the intensity of violence against said local communities. So the more an armed group consolidates, the less violence that we see in said local communities. Second, bandits across Kaduna and Zamfara are actually transitioning towards revenue collection mechanisms that require less violence and actually require greater cooperation with local communities. So revenues from kidnapping and cattle rustling is dwindling. So bandit groups are increasingly now relying on the taxation of farming as well as artisanal gold mines as sources for income and as sources for revenue for themselves. And these types of activities, as we argue in our report, require greater cooperation, especially with local communities, and are underpinned, yes, by the threat of violence that once established, doesn't necessarily materialize into physical violence. So, for instance, when we think about banditry violence, yes, bandits initially attacked gold miners, but as they have consolidated their influence over mining sites, they are increasingly turning into this taxation. And we also show that since 2022, some groups are now directly engaged in mining activities. So this might explain this decrease that we see when it comes to the violence that are targeting civilians in these hotspot areas that deal with armed bandits and banditry violence. Now I want to turn to the third graph. And the third graph highlights the clashes that we see between armed bandit groups and state security forces. Military interventions, especially during this period that we track, 2018 to 2023, increased what we say is the geographic displacement of bandit groups. So yes, some bandit groups were displaced out of Zamfara and Kaduna and went to other neighboring states to pursue revenue generating opportunities and also to avoid military interventions. But we do argue that this displacement appears to be typically temporary. And we see a lot of bandits, and we have heard from community leaders and the people that we interviewed that bandits were returning to their original regions of operations and often were meting out reprisal attacks because of cooperation with state security forces. And we will see with the third graph that, yes, there are clashes between bandits and state security forces. They have increased since 2018. But in Zamfara, clashes between state forces and bandit groups over this period, especially after we see this law, is increasingly increasing when we look at 2022 to 2023. And then, our report kind of talks about the different types of attacks that bandits have done towards state security forces and the rationale behind these attacks. So we've seen, for instance, some attempts to seize weapons, but certainly we are arguing that this confrontation with state security forces is pointing to this growing confidence by bandit groups to challenge the Nigerian state security forces. And, for a lot of security experts, the direct attacks against state security forces are typically perceived as political, not necessarily criminal. And this is reflecting, as we argue, the growing threats that bandit groups pose to the state in northwest Nigeria. Okay, I want to pause here and also talk about some of what the state forces have done when it comes to trying to manage the escalating violence from banditry groups in Kaduna and Zamfara. So if we go to the next slide, for instance, we would see that state forces have intensified their use of air and drone strikes to support ground operations, especially in rural communities that border forest and neighboring states, as the map that you're seeing shows. However, as we show in our report, state attacks on bandit groups are typically reactive. So yes, we would have bandit attacks against civilians. They trigger public outcry. This enhances pressure on the state to intervene, and this triggers military operations. So it is not necessarily proactive, but this is a military intervention that is reactive. And we note in the report that as bandits, as we know them, are increasingly evolving towards extracting revenues from communities, especially when these platforms are beyond large-scale, eye-catching violence as we know today. This would have implications on the willingness of the military to actually launch some of these retaliatory operations in some of these areas that have a lot of these groups. And yes, the Nigerian government and security forces have said since February of this year that they have been able to eliminate several bandit leaders, but we do argue in the report that it remains uncertain whether some bandit leaders have indeed been killed, as it's very, very, very hard to verify these claims. It's very challenging, especially when the dust has not necessarily settled. So bringing it all together, because I have been talking for a long time, if you don't get anything, I'm hoping that you can get something from my concluding statement, which is basically, while military operations may contribute to an overall decrease in violence by banditry groups, as we see in Zamfara and Kaduna, it is likely that this bandit consolidation of influence over some of these regions and the evolution, as I said, that my colleagues are going to talk about when it comes to revenue extraction, this is increasingly playing a larger role when it comes to shaping the trends of violence that we see in the Northeast. So when we see decreases in violence, this should not be interpreted as indications of lessened bandit operations or weakened groups. It's actually quite the opposite. Bandit groups, as we know today, are increasingly being able to extract revenue without perpetrating violence and are usually in coerced cooperation with a lot of these local communities. And now I will turn it over to Lawan. Thank you very much.
Lawan, apologies, you're on mute. Could you go from the top, please?
Thank you, Nella. Thank you very much, Jumo. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I will be speaking about the ecosystem of armed bandits in Northwest Nigeria. So to start with, the landscape in Nigeria's Northwest region is highly fragmented, with an estimated number of between 80 and 120 distinct bandit gangs operating under different leaders. You could have dozens or up to 30, about up to 30 of armed bandit groups operating in a given community. As we found out in this report, in one of the places where we conducted interviews, that is Wonaka, under Gusau local government, about 20 to 30 groups of bandits operate, in those areas. There is no, the actual number of bandits operating throughout the Northwest is not known, but it is estimated that about 20,000 and between 20 and 30,000 armed bandits, are operating in the region and also in some part of the North Central region. Almost 1/3 of the armed bandits are estimated to be in Zamfara and several thousand in Kaduna. I will talk about recruitment. Recruitment into armed bandit groups is influenced by many factors. I'm going to discuss the key ones here. Firstly, the first method that the bandits used during the period that the previous speaker spoke about, which was the escalation period, was to appeal to the ethnic backgrounds of Fulani people who were at that time supposedly being attacked by Hausa vigilantes in Zamfara. So they use, some form of ethnic exaltation to call on them to join bandit groups, in order to protect their communities. And that was when the phrase "Yaro shiga kungiya ka kare gidanku," became very much popular around the time. It meant, join the group and protect your family. However, it is key to underscore that many structured bandit groups took clear shape in a context of growing reprisal attacks by vigilantes. This is explicitly pointed by some bandit leaders, including Dogo Gide. Dogo Gide is a prominent bandit leader in northwest Nigeria, and he is known to operate in some parts of the northeast, yes, north central Nigeria. So he claimed that they resorted, to take up arms in order, because they were being unfairly targeted by state forces and local vigilantes. Self-protection was, of course, one of the reasons that has been vocalized, as the main push factor for people to join bandit groups in the Northwest. Self-protection, as I have mentioned, has also been emphasized by some other bandit leaders. One of them said he was forced to join, to take up arms after his father was kidnapped and killed by some people, supposedly, from the Hausa ethnic groups who were members of a vigilante, and nobody, took any action. The traditional authorities didn't do anything, and local authorities did not do anything. And he said, if you don't take up arms, you may end up, losing not only your money and your farms, but also your family. So they believe joining forces or joining armed bandit groups confers some protection, on them. Another reason why people join banditry is to gain access to weapons and safe means of livelihood. And this is so much true, for young, especially for young men who join bandit groups. These young men are typically impoverished and unemployed. Most of them teenagers or in their 20s. So they are recruited to serve as foot soldiers who carry out acts of kidnapping, cattle rustling, and lethal violence. Self-protection, this underscores, the role of financial resources in people's willingness to join armed bandit groups. Recruitment into armed bandit groups does not always happen voluntarily. As we've seen since 2011, armed bandit groups in both Birnin Gwari and Don Sado, where we conducted interviews, have periodically resorted to using force to recruit young Fulani men, into their fold. Families, who are unwilling to surrender their male children for recruitment faced, a difficult choice. They either relocate to other states or risk losing their cattle to the gangs as a retribution. The role of theft, too, is another prominent factor that has influenced recruitment into armed bandit groups. As we have found out, many people joined armed bandit groups in order to, protect their cattle from being stolen, or in order to recover cattle that had been stolen by bandit groups. So in a nutshell, a lot of factors, play key roles in influencing who joins or who becomes a bandit. I will speak about hierarchy and roles in armed bandit groups. The structure of armed bandit groups is complex and poorly understood. These characteristics, contribute to the group's resilience. The hierarchical structure of the groups ensures, flexibility by allowing members to work under different armed bandit leaders at different times. Some bandit leaders coordinate multiple operational bases in different locations. Bigger bandit groups are known, to have well-organized leadership structures with clearly delineated roles for members in command positions. Mostly, the groups, these bigger groups, are led by kachallas. The kachallas are the leaders and who have overall control over the group and take strategic, decisions involving the groups. They receive information, from informants and other members of the group, who advise them on potential targets. And it's only the kachalla who gives the last order, as to where and when to launch attacks. He is deputized, by someone, mostly, somebody who is trusted and who makes tactical decisions and even succeeds the kachalla if the latter dies. The deputy, oversees the intelligence and logistics units, which handle intelligence gathering and the provision of supplies to the group, respectively. So there are other foot soldiers, or there are other members at lower cadres. There are the ones that are responsible for carrying out attacks and raids. We have below them those ones, the units that carry out cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom, motorbike. They comprise, they carried out cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom, and provide security at camps, and also, look after kidnapped victims. And there is some form of specialty recruitment for people who engage in cattle rustling. Not all members of armed bandit groups, carry out cattle rustling. Specializations or requirements that one has to meet, to be able to take part in this activity. There are also informants, and these informants are prominent roles in advising leaders as to who to target and who to rob, who to kidnap. They also, point them at the direction of where there is cattle resources that they can go and rustle, and also inform on the activities of security forces and vigilantes. These informants are usually embedded in communities. They don't stay with the armed bandits in the forest, but they are within, ensconced within communities. And their positioning gives them, advantage point and advantage sort of to be able to collect this intelligence that they will feed, to bandit groups. While it is difficult to accurately sketch out the profile of typical informants, they typically collaborate with bandit groups in exchange for financial payments. Next slide, please. Nigeria's northwest banditry landscape is characterized by both fragmentation and strong cooperation between groups. And this presents a major challenge to responses. While the fragmented nature makes it difficult for authorities and communities to engage them in dialogue, extensive cooperation enables groups, to launch collaborative large-scale attacks against local communities, as well as repel vigilantes and state security forces. The shared grievances and shared ethnicity that these groups hold, in some instances, have significantly contributed to a strong sense of camaraderie between different gang leaders, leading to a strong culture, of cooperation. And armed bandit groups emphasize this camaraderie and cooperations between groups as crucial for their survival. One of the bandit leaders that we spoke to in Zamfara told us that they support each other in case of military or vigilante offensive, and they come together, to do that, to repel such attacks. That which shows that that is key, to their survival. Mentorship is in bandit groups, although intra-group mentorship is common, although intra-group and intergroup, intra-generational conflicts are also frequent. So it's common for senior bandit members, to seek the approval of the bandit leader, the Kachala, for them to move out of that area and establish their own territory. This is another factor that has contributed, or that is contributing significantly to collaborative engagement. These intergenerational conflicts and the splintering of groups can also operate as a driver for geographic diffusion. As some groups, which I have just highlighted, as some groups move to find a new territory. The collaborative dynamics alongside flexibility of bandit group membership and configurations are one factor underpinning the resilience of armed bandits in the face of state and community interventions. Okay, it is crucial to note also, notwithstanding instances of cooperation, that conflicts do flare up among or between bandit groups, vying for control of specific communities or over cattle distribution and ransom payments. And we have seen these factors at play around February to March in parts of Zamfara, especially, where armed bandit groups, turn their guns against each other because of alleged cattle rustling, intragroup cattle rustling, as well as move by other groups to establish territories, in areas that are considered the preserve of some groups. So we have seen that as at play. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the relationship between armed bandits and violent extremist organizations. Armed bandits are not the only non-state armed groups that are operating in the Northwest. This is important to highlight from the onset. From 2013, insurgent groups, to a differing extent, started establishing camps in forests across Kaduna and Zamfara. And coincidentally, these two places, or these two states, are the epicenters of armed bandit groups in Nigeria. So from there, they have gradually spread, to neighboring states. In the quest, to move to the West, some elements of insurgent groups appear to have been supported by bandit groups. Since 2021, increasingly overlapping areas of operations have enhanced opportunities for both collaboration and contestation between bandit and violent extremist groups. Collaboration between armed bandits and insurgent groups differs from collaboration among armed gangs due to ideological and structural differences. This is a point further elaborated on in this section. Escalating state attacks have increasingly forced armed bandit groups and Ansaru, Jazz, and ISWAP to operate in closer proximity, establishing camps close to each other within a shrinking geography or within shrinking geographies out of state reach. Reports from Zamfara indicate that Islamist militants have established training camps and hideouts near Mutu village in Gusau and near Birnungwari forest in Kaduna. In 2021, for instance, Jazz reportedly relocated some of its bomb fabricators from the northeast to Rijana, Igabi, and Chikun areas of Kaduna under the leadership of one of its top members, Bakura Baduma. There is also a growing presence of ISWAP in Kogi and Niger states. These two states are located in the north-central Nigeria. This emphasizes the growing opportunities for friction or partnership between insurgent and armed bandit factions. Okay, I will also want to highlight the varied relationships between various groups in the Northwest. I will start with Ansaru. After the group was expelled from Maiduguri in 2013, Ansaru and its splinter, or just like its splinter, Boko Haram, established itself in forests and remote areas with limited state presence. For Boko Haram, of course, they chose to move into rural parts of the Northeast where state presence was limited, only later enhancing presence in the Northwest. But Ansaru, you know, after it was evicted from the Northeast, it quickly moved into the Northwest in 2013. And by 2014, the group was already moving into Birnungwari and before later spreading to other areas, including Dansado and Zamfara. But unlike the Northeast, where Jazz used violence to gain control over communities, Ansaru arrived in the Northwest with an expansionist agenda. And this agenda, you know, was to seek to build popularity and legitimacy among local communities. Ansaru elements sought to incentivize communities to join them with the aim of converting the largely Muslim population of the Northwest to their version of Islam. And while the group did gain some degree of acceptance around Kwasa and Old Kuyelu in Birnungwari, they were resisted by some communities such as Damari, also around Birnungwari. And one other strategy that Ansaru, you know, employed to gain acceptance was to align its revenue extraction activities closely with communities' perception of legitimacy. And this further, you know, contributed to communities' more positive perspective of the group than of armed bandits. For example, Ansaru group is not involved in cattle rustling or kidnapping for ransom and extortion from villagers. And all these activities, you know, that bandits are, you know, well entrenched in doing. Instead, Ansaru focuses on mining resources, farming, and collection of zakat, which is a certain proportion of wealth required to be donated by Muslims to charity. So, as part of their efforts to gain community legitimacy, Ansaru positioned themselves as security providers to communities against bandit attacks. in some cases bringing them into conflict with bandit groups. For example, on 13 July 2022, armed bandits attacked Damari, a small town in eastern Birnin Gwari. Some Ansaru members were carrying out preaching activities in the locality to the locals, and so they responded with superior firepower, forcing the bandits to beat a retreat. The armed bandits killed 2 locals though, but the locals believed that many more would have been killed if not for the intervention by the violent extremist group, Ansaru. So Ansaru militants has also reportedly engaged in clashes with armed bandits in some parts of Gusau, culminating in the demise of one bandit leader, and Ansaru seizing weapons and motorcycles from the bandit group. Wild clashes between have been common between Ansaru and armed bandit groups. Wild clashes have been common between Ansaru and bandit groups. There have also been examples of collaboration. The famous bandit kingpin Dogo Gide was believed to be close to Ansaru members, with some accounts linking him to influencing the group's relocation to Dansado. There is a lot to this point, but I have to move on. Maybe we will discuss more during Q&A. Let me quickly jump to Jazz. Jazz, as outlined above, has typically used violence or more coercive practices to garner support among communities, arguably more in line with bandit approaches. Reflecting this, Jazz repeatedly preached less against violence perpetrated by bandits than the other violent extremist groups, operating in the Northwest. Jazz, there are no reports of Jazz, clear reports of Jazz operating in Zamfara or Katsina, but in Birnin Gwari residents have linked armed bandits with Jazz because some bandits, especially Dogo Gide's group, wear long robes and chant Allahu Akbar, God is great, the same way the violent extremist group like Ansaru and Jazz and Ansaru do during attacks. Also, communities in Kaduna report instances of cooperation between Jazz militants and armed bandits who had established hideouts within and around Birnin Gwari forest. Though distinguishing between different violent extremist groups by local communities is fraught with challenges. Like in the case of Ansaru, there have been cases of collaboration between bandit groups and Jazz in the context of mass abduction. Mass abductions has been seen on 11th December 2020, when a bandit leader, Awolun Daudawa, working with several other armed bandit groups, kidnapped 300 school children in Kankara, Katsina State. The bandit groups handed the responsibility of negotiating the ransom and release of the school children over to Jazz. The Boko Haram leader at the time, Abubakar Shekau, claimed responsibility for the kidnapping in a video. And media reports, had it that a large sum of money was paid as ransom before the children were released. But government have continuously denied that. So despite instances of collaboration, clashes between Jazz and bandit groups are also abound. Illustratively, on 16 July 2022, a group of armed bandits ambushed ambushed members of JAS near a community controlled by the extremists in Birnin Gwari, and this led to the death of some JAS members. I will quickly touch on ISWAP and then hand over to Kingsley. ISWAP's expansion into the Northwest is a relatively recent phenomena that started only around 2020, and this could not be unconnected with the fact that ISWAP is it's a new faction of the insurgent groups operating in Nigeria. So they started moving into the area in 2020 after the death of Abubakar Shekau. Since then, the group is reported to have established its presence in Kuyambana Forest in Zamfara and launched several attacks in other parts of the region. One of the factors responsible for the group's geographic expansion may be to enhance coordination with ISGS cells operating in Niger Republic, reflecting, of course, the group's close ties with the global IS ecosystem. There is less evidence regarding ISWAP's engagement with bandit groups, even though ISWAP, like JAS and Ansaru, targets government forces and installations, as well as all non-Muslims. I will thank you very much. I will hand over to Kingsley to continue with the presentation. Kingsley?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lawan. And so I will take it from here. And there's a lot to say, and I will try as much as possible to narrow in on bandit financing and resourcing, which is a subject matter that is arguably the least understood because it has attracted the least attention in the literature, particularly when you look at existing literature on armed banditry in the Northwest. And it is important because it directly underpins the resilience of armed banditry and also does a lot in terms of serving as a motivation for armed banditry recruitment. Next slide, please. So armed bandits in the Northwest and increasingly in the North Central draw their finances and resources from various illicit and licit economies. And in Kaduna and Zamfara, armed bandits utilize 5 main revenue streams. The first one is cattle rustling. The second one is kidnapping for ransom. The third is artisanal gold mining. And the fourth is extracting rents from road users, either in the form of extortion or in the provision of transport services. And then the fifth and final is the taxation of farmers, which also includes seizing of farms and forced labor, like we have seen recently. So another point to be made at this juncture is that there are 3 important ways that armed bandits engage with illicit economies. So we have seen that armed bandits flexibly move between 3 types of engagement with both licit and illicit economies. The first strategy of engagement is in the form of targeted attacks and robberies directed at the supply chain. The second form of engagement is in the imposition of levies on market participants. And then the third and final strategy of engagement that we have observed and elaborated upon in the report is in the assumption of control over parts or the entirety of the supply chain of specific commodities, such as artisanal gold or the cattle market. Now, if you look at the pie charts on the slide, which is based on ACLED data, they show the levels of recorded violence related to different armed banditry activities. You can see from the slide that in both Kaduna and Zamfara, a lot of violence is associated with kidnapping. However, more violence is associated with cattle rustling in Zamfara than in Kaduna. And these are some of the dynamics and nuances that I really want to shed light on in the next few moments. Now we will zoom in on each of these revenue streams and I will look at them chronologically. So next slide, please. So the first is cattle rustling. And if you look at it from 2011, when armed banditry started gaining notoriety in Northwest Nigeria, to about 4 to 5 years ago, I think 2019 to be precise, the livestock market was a major source of revenue for armed bandits operating in Kaduna, Zamfara, and other parts of the Northwest. At first, it was stealing and reselling the cattle heads. This was the main strategy. But this was not the only strategy. Armed bandits also drew revenue through the imposition of levies on herders. So these levies were said to be protection, but this protection was not fully guaranteed because other bandit groups, even if one bandit leader offers you protection, another bandit group can come and steal your cattle. So herders have generally perceived the imposition of levies very negatively. But since 2019, we noticed that the profitability of cattle rustling, or how lucrative it is, and the feasibility of even imposing levies have both diminished due to the depletion of herds through rustling and then the relocation of cattle herders to safer areas. And then also, simultaneously, there's been a growing reluctance among buyers to purchase cattle known to be stolen. This also led to a major decline in prices in the Northwest since 2016. In Birnin Gwari and Maru, for example, decreased occurrences of cattle rustling appear to loosely align with increased incidents of kidnapping, the next point that I want to speak on. So faced with a sustained decline in revenue from cattle rustling, armed bandits increasingly turned to kidnapping from 2019. This became their primary source of income for many of the groups, actually. Next slide, please. So kidnapping. Kidnapping in Nigeria, of course, for I'm sure most of the listeners and particularly my co-presenters, is a countrywide phenomenon. It affects every region and it involves different criminal actors and criminal networks. However, as the map on the slide indicates, the Northwest is the worst affected. Different actors engage in kidnapping in other parts of the country, for example, including JAS and ISWAP in the Northeast, cult groups and other criminal actors in the South and the Southeast. But armed bandits have clearly perpetrated more kidnappings in the Northwest and North Central regions than all other actors combined. Between 2019 and 2022, kidnapping reached its peak as armed bandits targeted affluent farmers, businessmen, and school children, collecting millions in ransom payments. But the pool of these potential targets dwindled as many victims faced with financial ruin from repeated ransom demands, relocated, or even tragically lost their lives. for failing to pay ransom. So kidnapping incidents in Birnin Gwari, Gusau, and Maru, where we conducted extensive field work, if you look at it, varied extensively from the graph on the slide. Birnin Gwari saw a peak in 2021. Gusau had a consistent increase from 2019 to 2022, followed by a decline in 2023. And Maru experienced surges in 2019 and 2021 with fluctuations in subsequent years. Now, it is important to note that these trends are influenced by a combination of factors, including military operations and then the currency policy changes in 2023, and then the shifts in bandit activities and population displacements. However, though kidnapping of individuals has been declining since 2023, we noticed an escalation of mass abductions in the first quarter of this year. At least we know 500 people were kidnapped in a string of large-scale abductions occurring in both the Northeast and the Northwest regions. So while kidnappings are expected to continue as an important source of financing for armed bandits, the artisanal gold mining industry is progressively becoming the primary revenue source for armed bandits. Now let's turn to the artisanal gold mining sector. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, as revenues from kidnapping and cattle rustling have declined, bandits have increasingly turned to gold mining industry for financing. Now, armed bandits' interactions with the gold mining industry is very interesting and has evolved over time. So initially, bandits attacked and robbed miners and intermediaries involved in the purchasing of gold at the mining sites. And these attacks escalated and started attracting media attention, I think sometime around 2016. This was particularly after an attack that left about 36 gold miners dead in Zamfara state. Now, these attacks intensified further between 2016 and 2018, especially in Kaduna and Zamfara. And during such incidents, typically what we see is bandits seize the money, gold, and other valuables while causing numerous fatalities. So these violent actions not only resulted in direct plunder, but also instilled a deep sense of fear in target communities, ensuring compliance with bandit directives in the future. Such lethal attacks and robberies were more frequent in areas where bandits aim to assert dominance. And this reflects and underscores the point that Jumo earlier made in her presentation. But the interesting thing, what happened was in response to the escalating bandit attacks on gold mining operations, what we see is the federal government imposed a ban on all mining activities in Zamfara in April 2019. And it is interesting and an important point to make because this form of knee-jerk, this type of reaction we have seen in other parts of both Western and Central Africa, where government imposed blanket bans on illicit and licit economies. So in the wake of the ban, bandits continued imposing levies on miners as protection fee to gain access to various artisanal gold mining sites in Zamfara and Kaduna, and of course, increasingly in parts of Niger State. Since late 2023, armed bandits have started seizing full control of certain gold mining sites in Kaduna, expelling all mining companies, even those with affiliations to the state government, and particularly also Chinese firms, and working in the mines themselves. So what we see is a transition from robbery and dispossession of gold miners, of gold, money, and other valuables, to actually taking control of the mines after they have imposed levies. And now it is important to we cannot overemphasize this point, that given the substantial gold reserves in the Northwest, the industry presents armed bandits with a significant earning potential, but could also attract other armed groups, intensifying competition over control and escalating instability in the region. So this is an important point. Next slide, please. Now, briefly, I'll just touch on how armed bandits draw rents or draw revenue from the roads. So in Northwest, roads are crucial for armed bandits' revenue generation through operating transport businesses, and then also through extorting commercial motorists and engaging in armed robbery and abductions on the roads. So we know that, for example, armed bandits like Dandela have entered the transport sector amidst the suspension of commercial services by commercial motorists due to the growing insecurity in the region. And apart from this, of course, there are not so many examples of armed bandits that have engaged in commercial provision of commercial transport services. But what we have seen is one of the major ways that armed bandits draw rents from the roads and highways is through armed robberies, through abductions, and through the extortion of motorists. Next slide, please. So the final revenue stream that armed bandits rely on is the taxation of farmers, and then including seizing of those farms and also using forced labor to cultivate and harvest from these farms. So since 2021, bandit groups and Kaduna have imposed taxes on farming communities, charging between 5 to 10 million naira per season for access to farmlands. This illegitimate taxation occurs both before planting and then during harvest. And I think I'll leave this here, and then we can discuss it further in the Q&A section. But there's a point I want to touch before I close, which is the governance elements, or the elements of governance functions that we see in armed bandits. Next slide, please. So armed bandits groups vary greatly in their characteristics, making it difficult to actually generalize their governance practices. However, an examination of several groups in specific areas suggests that they engage in governance behaviors, primarily by regulating community conduct and also influencing local economies, especially when this is considered through the prism of criminal governance. So bandits generally enforce rules against communities, and this is a form of criminal governance. These rules, a major part of them is to stop communities from sharing information with state forces. And they use a lot of violence like looting and abductions and even lethal attacks as punishment for those that infringe on this regulation. In some instances, we have also seen where armed bandits have also imposed other codes of conduct on communities. And some of this appear to be directly linked to their alliances with violent extreme organizations. For example, Dogo Ibe, a prominent bandit leader that Lawan made reference to, he was allied with Ansaru. And because of that, at a point, he enforced bans on alcohol and drugs. And this underscores why we need to further understand the interactions and relationships between armed bandits and violent extremist groups and the implications for their relationship with local communities and how this should shape intervention programs and responses. We've also seen, for example, with Kachala Turji, where when he arrives in a particular location, village heads usually flee. And we have seen situations where he himself has imposed individuals to serve as village heads. And this is an interesting point that also underscores this elements of criminal governance that we are increasingly observing in the Northwest. I'll conclude. So in conclusion, next slide. What does this mean? If you look at what has happened, the scenario in the Northwest, what we have seen is an over-reliance on military operations. So our findings point to the need for a multi-pronged, multifaceted response strategy that includes security measures, three sets of approaches, actually. Security measures, which should include disrupting communication and collaboration between bandit leaders through the use of technology, and I can speak more to this during the Q&A. And then secondly, preventing extortion during planting and harvesting seasons. Thus, understanding the seasonal conduct of armed bandits in relation to local communities and tailoring responses that address this seasonal engagements. And then on the community resilience response strategies, we think there's need for providing alternative means of livelihoods to vulnerable communities and individuals. For example, communities destabilized by violence are very susceptible to recruitment, as we have seen in the past, and it's still happening in both the Northwest and even the Northeast. So it's crucial to prioritize these vulnerable groups by offering alternative livelihoods. For example, like support for crop farming where land permits to deter them from turning to armed banditry. And then another community resilience approach is tackling informants, a problem that I'm sure you heard when Lawan actually hammered on. So there's need to recognize and address the role of informants in sustaining armed banditry through awareness programs and income-generating projects for vulnerable groups, simultaneously dismantling informant networks with effective intelligence and targeted policing. So we are not advocating for a military response against informants, but more of a community resilience initiative, which includes educating about informant risks and providing alternative livelihoods to disrupt support for bandit groups beyond law enforcement alone. And then also, as part of the community resilience, is to intensify intelligence gathering through collaborative approaches with local communities. We know that one of the major factors that has undermined effective responses to armed banditry is the mutual suspicion and mistrust between local communities and state forces. There's need for collaborative approaches for authorities to work with local communities and engage them in the act of intelligence gathering, especially within the context of dismantling informant networks. The last point is regulatory responses. So first of all, there's need to formalize the artisanal gold mining sector as a major response to the engagements that armed bandits have with the gold mining sector. So rather than banning the mining sector, there's need to promote and facilitate the formalization of artisanal gold mining. This, of course, involves registering miners, enhancing security at the mines, and strengthening regulatory bodies. These measures aim to disrupt bandit revenue streams reduce support for bandit groups, and minimize recruitment opportunities, as it has been suggested repeatedly in GI-TOC's research. So another point under regulatory responses is entrenching a system of accountability for self-defense groups. Engagement with local vigilantes like the Yensake should prioritize respect for human rights and the rule of law to break the cycle of reprisals, which has contributed to foiling banditry recruitment. So self-defense groups in general must condemn extrajudicial killings to mitigate reprisal attacks. The state should be seen to hold self-defense groups accountable, publicizing cases to tackle rampant impunity. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you excuse me. Thank you so much, Kingsley. Thank you to all of our presenters. It's been a fascinating set of presentations. We already have a lot of questions flowing into the Q&A box, which is very exciting. I'm gonna start. I can see that we've got quite a few that focus on geography. So I'm gonna try and group these thematically, and then I'll give each of you a turn to speak. Please keep your answers as concise as you can so that we can address some of the other questions as well. So the first geographic question, apart from Kogi and Niger states in north-central Nigeria, is there any link between violent conflict in Plateau with the bandit groups in Nigeria? That's the first one. Do we think that these organized bandit groups will establish themselves in Adamawa state? What is it about Kaduna and Zamfara that make these areas hubs for the violent groups? And finally, I think I saw one more, which was, excuse me, there was a question. Yes, is there any reason why Jigawa state seems immune from banditry? Jumo, can we start with you and then we'll go in the order of the speakers, so then to Lawan and then to Kingsley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nella. And I'm going to try to answer the questions that I can answer, and I'm sure my colleagues who are also on the field are going to be able to contribute. I can answer the first one, which has to do with Plateau and the connection with banditry. And I would say, yes, generally speaking, Nigeria's bandits, as we know, are rural gangs that are engaging in criminal activities. And that's how we have actually defined it in our report. So when we think about criminal activities, we're looking at, and we are tracking cattle rustling, the looting of villages, the extortion of local communities, kidnapping for ransom. And we also see that playing a big role in Plateau State. It might not necessarily be on the scale of Kaduna and Zamfara, but banditry is widespread throughout the country. And it is spreading towards the north central regions. But yes, it is more acute in the northwest, especially in Zamfara State. And, you can also go into the methodology of our report with how we have also classified banditry in that sense. Okay, with the question about Jigawa, I think it's also interesting to note where it is located. When we look at Kaduna, when we look at Zamfara, we see porous borders, we see forests. It's easy for these bandits to go into these areas and to build their bases, right? And that is why when you're thinking as a non-armed group, you're also thinking about spaces where you can consolidate your control, spaces where state security forces aren't necessarily able to gain entry very easily. And that is the advantage that places like Kaduna and Zamfara provide for non-armed groups with, forested terrains, mountains that other states don't necessarily provide. And then I will pass it on to Lawan, who might be able to answer some of the other questions on Adamawa and other porous borders.
Okay, thank you very much, Jumo. Yeah, you have rightly identified, to my mind, some of the factors responsible, to these dynamics in Plateau, Jigawa, and to a larger extent, Kaduna State. what I only need to add here, is that yes, Kaduna and Zamfara, going back to one of the questions, are hubs because in addition to all these points that you have highlighted, they offer, they have the kind of terrain that favors the kind of operations that bandits are engaged in. And so you can see a lot of kidnapping for ransom activities, cattle rustling activities, and even artisanal gold mining that bandit groups are going into recently are located within a certain geography, that is shared, or a certain location that is a border area that is shared between these two groups, and it's a forested area. And if you look at how these groups operate, you will see that they are not only in Zamfara or Kaduna. Because of the access they gain through this forest covers, they are into Niger State in north-central Nigeria. They are well entrenched in Katsina State, also in northwest Nigeria. That's it. And they are also in Sokoto as well as in Kebbi. One of the major, contributions that forest cover give to these groups, is the ability to escape from security or vigilante offensive, and to be able to hide the stolen cattle, as well as to also hide people they have abducted. And we've seen over the years that, banditry or its expansion has, been taking this dimension. And other things, of course, would have also contributed. Initially, we know that in Kaduna, it all started around cattle. In Zamfara, sorry, it all started around cattle, and it subsequently got into Kaduna after, there was virtually little or no cattle to steal in Zamfara. So if I may link my response to the next question from Adamawa, I would say, banditry, is about moving for cattle first, and then violence will follow. So it is not unlikely that Adamawa, of course, is going to experience some form of armed banditry, because they have a very good population of cattle that hasn't been touched or disturbed yet. But one factor that is going to be a major constraint for this group, to be able to migrate or to move into Adamawa is the issue of lack of forest connection linking the northwest and the north central Nigeria. So I think these are some of the questions I wanted to offer my response to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jumo and Lawan. Kingsley, if it's okay, I'm going to give you a number of these questions that are related to the financing aspect that you described. So first of all, we have a question asking, why is it that the government persistently denies paying ransoms to bandits despite there being plenty of evidence of them doing so? And we also have a couple of questions on artisanal gold mining. First of all, whether bandits have a technical knowledge of artisanal gold mining, and whether that is inhibiting their ability in any way. And secondly, can you tell us a bit more about the implications of their takeover of a number of these artisanal mining sites? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nella. Super interesting questions. So to start with, the ransom, why does government always deny paying ransom? And because it's something that speaks directly to the competence and capacity and to a large extent, the legitimacy of the government of the day. And moreover, the government has clearly actually outlawed paying ransom. So you don't actually expect government to pay ransom and then actually admit that they're paying ransom. Of course, there've been a lot of reports about government paying ransom. And there's a general belief among most Nigerians and analysts alike that government does pay ransom, but government has continued to deny these allegations simply because it doesn't speak well of the government. That's the obvious answer to that. And then there's another question on, do the armed bandits have technical knowledge of artisanal gold mining? And in my presentation, I try to trace the trajectory, how the transition that we've seen armed bandits had at the gold mines. So they started by robbing these gold mines, and then they graduated from that to imposing levies on these gold mines. And then more recently, we have seen them actually taking over gold mines. So we can say that at this point, definitely they are working with local community members who actually help them in doing the actual mining. But we know that over time, definitely they are becoming better in terms of the technicalities of managing these mines. And we know they already have established networks for channeling this the gold even to outside the country through Niger, for example. There's an extensive network. And so the question of how much technical knowledge they have is that they have a very evolving and growing technical knowledge. Lastly, what's the implications of the engagement of armed bandits with the gold mines, of taking over the gold mines? And I think this is one of the most important points that we must send very strongly across. The more armed bandits take control of gold mines, the more likely we're to experience lower levels of violence. And interestingly, with lower levels of violence, we're likely to see state authorities going to sleep. And so what are the implications of this? The implications of this is we've seen situations where armed bandits use the proceeds from these gold mines to actually acquire weapons. So for example, if they take over a gold mine in Birnungwari, we may not actually experience violence and instability in Birnungwari, but they're going to buy weapons and traffic these weapons to even other parts of the country, where we are going to definitely see an escalation of violence. So it has important implications. Another implication is we're likely to see this might attract other non-state armed groups like JENIM, like ISWAP, like we're seeing increasingly, like JAS. They're likely to be very much attracted because the gold mines actually present a very lucrative source of revenue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, we have actually a couple of questions that were related to Niger and also to nearby borders. We had a question that made reference to Kenya and to the East African equivalent of areas where there is a lot of ethnic tension expressed through castle rustling. In the case of Nigeria, is there do the bandits receive any kind of support from neighboring states or any sort of cross-border support? Likewise, we also had a question asking whether the Niger border closure after the coup affected the situation of bandits. Can I hand over to all three of you, whoever would like to jump in on that, please do. And if I may, I'm going to suggest we go 2 minutes over time for those who can stay with us so that we can get through all of the questions. Thank you. Would anyone like to start off on the Niger questions?
I can go first.
Thank you.
With the coup.
And this might be a very controversial opinion, but I do not think that that has any implication so far with the banditry activities that we are seeing. As Kingsley had mentioned, that a lot of times some of the weapon trafficking that we have seen in the Northwest are trafficked through Niger. And I do not necessarily think that that has stopped because of the coup d'etat that we see in Niger. I would also want us to look back to what happened about a year ago when Nigeria had said that they wanted to intervene in Niger, and the community leaders of Zamfara and Sokoto had gone in to talk to the Nigerian government saying, these are our brothers and sisters, and this is not something that we should possibly do. So I do think that there's still a lot of interaction between communities, especially in border regions, and that the weapons that we are seeing being used today with armed banditry is still flowing through the porous borders that we share with Niger. So that is how I would possibly answer that question. And it connects with Kenya too, with porous borders. They are definitely escalating the violence that we see in Niger. I do not necessarily know about external financing, but I'm sure my colleagues could possibly talk to that. But for the most part, this is a criminal enterprise. I think we have to put that at the forefront. It might evolve, it might not evolve, but when we think about armed banditry, we're thinking about economic motivations for the most part, and not necessarily political. And that's what makes this case very special.
Thank you, Jumo. Lawan and Kingsley, do you have any quick comments before we proceed to the last group of questions?
Okay, thank you, Nella. The form of resources that neighboring countries, contribute or use to support armed banditry in Nigeria are majorly, through arms trafficking networks, coming through Niger. Niger border, especially the ones in Libya and the one in Daura, are the major routes through which armed bandits in Nigeria receive weapons from international arms traffickers. This is for a lot of reasons, including the porous nature of the border. So, and then also, we know recently that some armed bandits who are engaged in gold mining, especially in Zamfara, have links to illicit gold traders who help them, to sell this gold through across the border. And it is in one of our interviews, it was related that the route passes through Niger. One of these armed bandit leaders is Halilu Sububu, who has sort of, halted act of violence since he discovered gold in Zamfara. He is presently established around gold mines in Anka, in that part of the country. Apart from gold and arms, I wouldn't know. Of course, I don't know if they receive some financial support or other support from other countries, such as Kenya. Yeah, I think, thank you. Okay, sorry, the next question that is related to this, whether or not the coup in Niger Republic has had an impact on armed banditry in Nigeria. Of course, yes, because before the coup, there was a form of collaboration between security forces, intelligence forces in Nigeria and Niger, to intercept and stop the flow of weapons and illicit goods from across the two borders. That in the past had been used to intercept armed traffickers on their way into Nigeria. And sometimes it even took Nigerian security officers, to cross over into Niger Republic because of the understanding, to effect such arrest. Those practices actually stopped immediately. There was coup and there was border closure. And as we learned subsequently, and even tracked through one of our reports, that there was some sort of increase in the flow of arms during that time, because security forces from Niger, stopped patrolling parts of the border through which, these illicit armed traffickers used to gain access into Nigeria. Of course, before the coup, it was also known that Nigerian forces were allowed to cross to certain, kilometers into Nigeria, about 3 kilometers, if I can remember correctly, to chase after criminals and armed bandits, especially. So they were very well known in areas, in communities under GPA, communities like Dara and some other communities. People in those communities even used to have phone numbers of, security officers in Niger, who they would quickly call to tell them of an ongoing attack in their community on the side of the Nigerian border. And those people will come, but all this, collaborations stopped after the coup. So, of course, it has had, the coup has had a huge impact, on activities of bandits in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to have to wrap up there, sadly. There's loads more great questions coming in, but we are out of time. Please feel free to get in touch with us and to email our speakers if you'd like to pick up any aspects of this discussion. You've been a wonderful audience. It's been a pleasure having you all stay with us through what's been a really, really interesting 90 minutes. So thank you so much, first of all, to our panelists, and secondly, to all of those who attended today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.